So, focal length. Let's start off with a written definition. The distance from the lens to the focal plane when the lens is focused on infinity. Even though that might sound very simple, I am throwing some new terminology out there that I think we should talk about. So the first phrase is focal plane. So where's the focal plane? What is that all about? So let's go to the next slide here. What do we mean by that? Well, let's take a look at this diagram. And I'm just going to bring over the 4x5 camera again just to illustrate this. If I were to spin this around so that it matches, there's our lens. I'm going to turn it this way. So now it matches our diagram. There's the lens. Light from the outside world comes in, goes through the camera, which is what's happening there, and it comes to a focus right here where this plate of glass is, which is where your sensor would be. So that is the focal plane, that spot back there. So that's where, if you were to change your focus, everything on your sensor, that's where everything is focusing, that is our focal plane. On that camera, it changes distance. We'll get into that in a moment. Anyways, focal plane, lens, the distance from here to there, that is our focal length. Sort of, okay? So let's continue. The distance from the lens to the focal plane when the lens is focused on infinity. So there's another word, infinity. So where is infinity? What do we mean by that? And I do have another video that you can watch but I'm going to try to explain it here. But the other video might help if you need to wrap your head around it a little bit better. So what do we mean by infinity? So we're going to take another look at this diagram here. And there's just a couple things we should talk about. And maybe there's a better slide right here. One concept I want to get across to you is what these red lines represent. And it says right here, incoming light. So light is coming in, it's bending at the lens, and it's coming to a focus point over here. But what I want to point out is, what do these two lines represent? Is this represent something in our scene that we're photographing? Is this the top of a tree or bottom of a tree? No. What that is light coming from one single point. So when we try to explain what's happening in photography, it's a little bit easier to simplify things. Here's a scene that's illustrating light bouncing off only two parts of this man's picture. Part of his jacket and part of his pipe. Light is bouncing everywhere. And you can imagine that light is bouncing off of everything else in the scene. It's too overwhelming. It's hard to follow the path of light. So to make things simple, we just think about spot and let's see what's happening there. So if we were to just think about his pipe and just imagine the light that's bouncing off of his pipe, so the light coming from the sun, hitting the pipe and bouncing off the pipe, and we were to follow those paths of light, there they are, striking the lens, bending, and then coming to a focus point upside down on the sensor. I don't want to get into why it's upside down, but it just is. And but what I want to draw your attention to is all these rays of light, all these pencil lines of light, as they call them. That's what these lines represent. This isn't the top of the scene and the bottom of the scene. These are two lines representing light coming from one single point in our scene. So, what do we mean by infinity? Good question. So, let's just focus on the light and let's think about what's happening. There's the light coming through, going through the lens and hitting our sensor, okay? And you can see that those lines are kind of forming a triangle. They are not parallel. But what happens if we start backing up? Well, as we start backing up, those lines start making their way to being more parallel. And the further we get, when we start to get really far away, and you were to zoom in and look at those lines, they are practically coming in as parallel. And when that happens, that's when we've reached infinity. Those lines are practically coming in, even though we could probably get some micro measurement and see that they're not quite parallel. For our purposes, they are. And when that happens, we've reached this area called infinity. So you can see the lines coming in and they're parallel. So the distance from the lens to the focal plane when the lens is focused on infinity. So let me just show you one more thing that will hopefully help you understand this a little bit better. And it's another time for me to use this opportunity for me to use this 4x5 camera. So just want to, again, sort of illustrate a concept for you. And so 4x5 camera, or I should say large format camera, there's the lens. This is where our sensor would be. So I just want to get across something that happens when we focus on stuff. And I'm just going to move that forward. So one thing that's kind of cool about this camera is we can see how the focusing is working. It's a little bit harder to see on your lens, and I've got a lens here, and as I move the focusing ring, this little piece is starting to stick out more or less depending on how I focus. And so when we focus on things, and let's say I was going to photograph, I have a little remote control here. If I was going to photograph it and I put it right there in front of the lens, that's really close to the lens. In order for me to focus on that, I have to be almost like this. And that's pretty much what it would look like if I had to focus on this. This is macro photography when you start photographing something this small. You might notice that your lens can't focus on things really close. You might have something called a minimum focusing distance. Well, that's because as this lens starts to come out and expand, which is what we're doing here, it stops. It can't go any further. And once you get there, you've kind of reached your minimum focusing distance. Later on, we're going to talk about macro photography, and you're going to see that one of the special things about a macro lens is that lens can just keep focusing, focusing, and focusing, so you can get really close to objects. Well, one thing that's nice about this camera is we can do that also. In fact, there are cameras like this that have this rail here that is much longer so that you can really extend this bellows. So if we photograph something really close, that's what it looks like. Well, if I was to take this remote control, so we've just photographed it, and then I start moving it further away. Well, as it starts getting further away, I have to keep adjusting my focus, as you can imagine. So something moves further away, I have to adjust my focus. Okay, now it's in focus, good. And let's say we keep moving it further and further away. Kind of like in our little illustration here, the man here just kept getting further and further away. And as he starts getting further and further away, our focus keeps changing, and that distance keeps getting closer and closer together until I get to a really interesting focusing range or focusing distance here. And so imagine if we were in this scene and we just kept telling the man, keep backing up, keep backing up. Eventually I'll get to this point where I don't have to change the focus anymore. Even if I tell that person to back up, I'll go to adjust my focus and I'll look at it and go, oh, I don't have to change the focus. It's still in focus. And the reason that I don't have to change the focus, because once we get to the point where these lines are coming in practically parallel, then there's no point changing the focus because there's nothing different about how the light is behaving when it hits the lens. When that person is at that distance, they have reached infinity. And it's different for every lens and camera combination. So when I look at this, if I were to get to the point where this remote control thing that we were photographing was so far away that it was at infinity, then I could take a ruler and I can measure from here to the lens. And you know what it would be? It would be the focal length of the lens. So if I were to measure this, I would probably get 210 millimeter. And when I look at this lens, hey, what do you know? It's a 210 millimeter lens. I think that's what it is, yeah, 210 millimeter. If this were a 50 millimeter lens, by the time my subject was at infinity, this would be much closer together And that distance from there to there would be 50 millimeter. So that's what makes a lens 50 millimeter or 100 millimeter or 200 millimeter. The distance from the lens to the focal plane when the lens is focused at infinity. This definition will be on the final exam, so make sure you know it. Anyway, that's it for this week.